The vultures circled overhead like black omens against the merciless Arizona sky, and their wings catching thermals that rose from the sun-baked earth below. Strange Caleb Boone thought through his whiskey haze vultures didn't usually gather unless something was already dead. But in Bitter Creek, death had a way of announcing itself early. The morning had started wrong. Old Pete from the livery stable had found fresh horse tracks around the town's perimeter, too many horses moving in formation like a military unit. The tracks were deep, suggesting heavily armed riders, and they circled the settlement like a noose drawing tight. But Sheriff Clay Murdoch had dismissed Pete's concerns with a wave of his hand, claiming they were probably just cowboys passing through. Now, as the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, those tracks had revealed their true purpose. The rope bit deep into Sister Magdalene's wrists as Red Voss's men dragged her into the town square. Her white habit, torn and bloodied from 3 days of captivity in the desert, hung in tatters from her trembling frame. The fabric, once pristine as fresh snow, now bore the stains of violence and desperation. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, framing a face that was pale but unbroken, marked by cuts and bruises, but still radiating an inner strength that made even hardened killers uncomfortable. The crowd gathered in a tight semicircle, their faces frozen between horror and shameful fascination, as the bandits forced her to her knees in the dust. Men who had fought in the war between the states, women who had survived Indian raids and prairie fires, children who had seen their share of frontier violence, all of them stood paralyzed, unable to move, unable to look away, unable to help. From the shadows between the general store and saloon, Caleb watched with eyes that burned like coals in his weathered face. At 45, he looked older than his years, the lines around his eyes speaking of too much pain and too little sleep. His clothes hung loose on his frame, the good muscle he'd once carried as a cavalry scout, now wasted by 3 years of steady drinking. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the rot-gut whiskey he'd been nursing since dawn, trying to quiet the demons that whispered in his ear every waking moment. 3 years of drowning his guilt had left him hollow, a ghost, haunting the edges of a town that barely tolerated his presence. The respectable citizens crossed the street to avoid him. Mothers pulled their children close when he stumbled past, and the saloon girls took pity on him only because his money was as good as anyone's. But something about the nun's defiant blue eyes, the way she held her chin high despite her terror, stirred memories he'd tried to kill with liquor. Emma. His daughter had possessed that same stubborn courage, that same refusal to bow down even when the odds were impossible. She'd been 8 when they murdered her, 8 years old, and braver than men twice her size. The memory of her last words, "Papa will come home soon," still echoed in his nightmares. "Look here, you good Christian folk." Red Voss's voice cracked across the square like a bullwhip jarring Caleb from his reverie. The mountain of a man stepped forward, his presence seeming to fill the entire space. He stood 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a coffin and arms scarred by a lifetime of violence. His red beard, streaked with gray, gave him his name, but it was his eyes, cold and calculating as a snake's, that marked him as truly dangerous. Got ourselves a holy woman who thinks prayers stop bullets. The crowd shifted uneasily, boots scraping against the packed earth. These were frontier people, hardened by violence and loss, accustomed to the harsh realities of desert life. They'd seen death before, dealt it when necessary, but there were lines even they wouldn't cross, or so they told themselves as they watched the unfolding horror without lifting a finger to stop it. 4 small figures huddled near the saloon's porch, their young faces etched with terror that no child should ever have to feel. These were the orphans the nun had been shepherding west when Voss's gang took them 3 days ago. Tommy, 12 years old, but already carrying a man's weight of responsibility on his thin shoulders, held the others close with arms that trembled from exhaustion and fear. His dark hair hung lank around a face that was too old for his years, marked by the kind of loss that aged a person from the inside out. Mary, 9, and struck mute by the fire that had claimed their sanctuary, pressed her face against Tommy's shoulder. The blaze at the Silver Falls orphanage had taken her voice along with 19 other children, leaving her unable to scream, even when the nightmares came. Her silence was complete, but her eyes spoke volumes, reflecting a depth of trauma that would take years to heal if it ever did. Samuel, 7, and frail as a desert flower in drought, shook with fever and terror. His thin frame seemed too small to contain the coughing fits that racked his body, and his pale skin bore the translucent quality of someone who spent too much time fighting illness. But despite his physical frailty, there was something unbreakable in his spirit, a quiet determination that reminded Caleb painfully of his own daughter. Little Rosie, only 5 years old, clutched a wooden cross with white-knuckled desperation. Her golden hair caught the harsh sunlight like spun silk, and her blue eyes held the kind of absolute faith that only the very young possessed. She was the baby of the group, but also in many ways the strongest, her innocence serving as an anchor for the others when the world became too dark to bear. The children. Sister Magdalene's voice carried across the square with startling clarity, cutting through the oppressive heat and tension like a blade. Despite everything she'd endured, despite the torn habit and the bruises marking her fair skin, her voice remained steady, strong, unbroken. "The children gonna watch," Voss snarled, gesturing toward the orphans, with a hand that bore the scars of countless fights. "They gonna learn what happens when folks cross Red Voss. They gonna see what happens to their precious holy woman when she don't know her place." Slick, a weasel-faced killer with a voice like grinding glass, stepped forward from the circle of bandits. His narrow features were marked by a long scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a knife fight in Tombstone. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but his guns were clean and well-maintained, the tools of a man who made his living with violence. "Let's see what the good Lord's been hiding under all that holy cloth." Slick leered, his yellow teeth gleaming in the sunlight. His laugh was sharp as broken bottles, cutting through the air with malicious glee. "Bet she ain't so high and mighty once we strip away all that pious pretense." The crowd stirred, but no one moved forward. At the edge of the gathering, Sheriff Clay Murdoch stood with his hand resting on his gun butt, his badge catching the sunlight like a mockery of justice. Clay was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the soft features of someone who'd grown comfortable with corruption. His uniform was clean, his boots polished, but his eyes held something that made Caleb's blood turn to ice water. Anticipation. The bastard was looking forward to this. "That's enough entertainment for now," Clay said, but his voice carried no authority, no demand for the violence to stop. Instead, it held the tone of someone managing a situation for his own benefit. "Unless you boys got something specific in mind." Voss's grin widened, revealing gold teeth that glinted like coins in a dead man's eyes. "Matter of fact, Sheriff, we do. Been thinking this town needs a lesson in manners. Lesson in what happens when folks don't show proper respect for their betters." He gestured broadly at the gathered townspeople, his voice rising to carry across the square. "See, we've been watching you good people for weeks now. Watching how you go about your business, how you count your money, how you sleep safe in your beds at night. And we got to thinking all that safety, all that comfort, it ain't free. Time you folks paid your dues, $10,000. The sum hung in the air like a death sentence. In a played-out mining town like Bitter Creek, where the silver had run out years ago and most folks scraped by on subsistence farming, and whatever trade they could manage, they might as well have asked for the moon. 10,000 by sundown. Voss continued his voice, taking on the cadence of a preacher delivering a particularly unpleasant sermon. "Or we start the real fun. And trust me, folks, you don't want to see what we got planned for your holy woman and her little birds." The crowd murmured uneasily, fear rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. Caleb studied the scene with eyes that had tracked Apache across 100 miles of desert that had guided cavalry units through hostile territory that had once been among the most respected in the Southwest. 6 of Voss's men plus whatever corrupt bargain they'd struck with Clay. All of them armed, all of them experienced killers. The crowd outnumbered them 10-1, but numbers meant nothing when the opposition held all the advantages. The townspeople were paralyzed by fear. But more than that, they were paralyzed by the knowledge of what resistance would cost them. Voss's reputation had preceded him, stories of burned-out settlements, of entire families slaughtered as examples of towns that had defied him and paid the ultimate price. The mathematics of survival weren't pretty, but they were simple: submit or die. 4 children whose lives hung by a thread. 1 broken drunk who'd failed everyone who'd ever mattered to him. And a nun whose faith was about to be tested in ways that no seminary had ever prepared her for. But as Voss's men began their calculated humiliation of Sister Magdalene, something shifted in Caleb's whiskey-fogged mind. The way little Rosie clutched her cross reminded him of Emma's last Christmas morning, when she'd held her new doll with the same desperate love, the same absolute faith that somehow everything would work out because Papa was there to protect her. He'd failed Emma, failed her completely, and utterly led her killers right to her door with his own careless trust. But maybe it wasn't too late to save these children. Maybe it was time to stop running from his ghosts and start making them count for something. Maybe it was time to remember what it felt like to be a man worth saving. The attack on the Silver Falls orphanage had come without warning, just as the children were settling down for evening prayers. Sister Magdalene still remembered every detail with crystalline clarity: the smell of smoke, the sound of screaming, the terrible crash of burning timbers as the roof collapsed. She'd managed to save these 4 from the flames, but 19 others had perished in the inferno, their young lives snuffed out before they'd really begun. The guilt ate at her like acid, a constant companion that whispered questions she couldn't answer. Why these 4? Why not the others? What divine plan could possibly justify the death of innocents? The questions haunted her prayers as she led Tommy, Mary Samuel, and Rosie westward toward the mission in San Francisco, where they'd promised to take the children in to give them a chance at a real life. They'd walked for weeks surviving on charity and faith, begging meals from isolated ranches and trading what little they had for safe passage through increasingly hostile territory. The children had been troopers about it, never complaining even when their feet bled or their stomachs cramped with hunger. But the strain was showing in all of them, in Tommy's hollow eyes, in Mary's deepening silence, in Samuel's worsening cough, in Rosie's occasional moments of despair when she thought no one was watching. When exhaustion finally forced them to seek shelter in Bitter Creek, Magdalene had hoped they'd found sanctuary. The town looked peaceful enough, nestled in a valley between red stone cliffs that provided some protection from the desert winds. The buildings were weathered but sturdy, speaking of a community that had weathered hard times and survived. It wasn't much, but it was civilization, and that was more than they'd seen in days. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, had welcomed them without question. Eleanor Patterson was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. She'd lost her own children to diphtheria years earlier, and her husband to a mining accident not long after. The boarding house was all she had left, but she ran it with the kind of fierce maternal energy that had made her something of a town institution. "You look like you need more than a meal," she'd said when she saw them standing on her porch, dusty and exhausted from the trail. Her weathered hands had been gentle as she helped Rosie out of her torn coat, her voice soft as she spoke to Mary in the kind of tones that might coax a frightened animal to trust. Sometimes, the Lord sends us exactly where we need to be, even when we can't see the purpose. But Bitter Creek carried its own shadows, and it didn't take long for Magdalene to sense them. The townspeople spoke in whispers about Red Voss's gang, about the terror that had gripped the territory for months. Every conversation died when strangers approached. Shop owners served customers quickly and avoided eye contact. Even the children playing in the streets seemed muted, their laughter forced and brittle. as if they were afraid that too much joy might draw unwanted attention. That first night, watching the empty streets from her window as thunder rolled across the desert and rain hammered the roof. Magdalene had seen him, the man slouched in the alley behind the saloon, a bottle his only companion. Even in the darkness, she could see the pain radiating from him, like heat from a forge, the way he held himself, as if every movement caused him physical agony. That's Caleb Boone. Mrs. Patterson had explained the next morning, her voice heavy with old sadness. Used to be the finest scout in the territory. Guided wagon trains worked with the cavalry, had a reputation for bringing folks through safely when others couldn't. Had a ranch north of town, raised some of the finest horses you ever saw. Good man, they all said. Devoted husband, loving father. She'd paused, glancing at the children to make sure they were occupied with their breakfast before continuing. Lost them 3 years back. Wife and daughter murdered by raiders while he was away on a job. Sarah was her name, pretty as a picture, sweet as honey. And little Emma. Mrs. Patterson's voice had caught. Emma was 8 years old, looked just like her mother, but had her father's eyes. Brave as anything that child was, Magdalene had nodded, understanding more than she'd wanted to. She'd seen what grief could do to a person, how it could eat away at them from the inside until nothing remained but an empty shell. But there was something else in Mrs. Patterson's expression, a flicker of knowledge quickly suppressed, as if she knew more than she was willing to say. Sheriff Clay took his guns after he started drinking. Mrs. Patterson had continued, her voice carrying an odd note, as if she didn't quite believe her own words. Said he was dangerous, that he might hurt himself or others. But I knew Caleb before it all went wrong. He was never a violent man, never cruel. Just broken. The children had absorbed this information with the kind of solemn attention that trauma survivors learned early. They understood brokenness, understood the weight of loss. Tommy had nodded, as if recognizing a kindred spirit, while Mary had looked toward the window with something that might have been sympathy. Samuel had coughed softly, the sound somehow conveying more understanding than words. And Rosie had simply said, "The sad man needs help." Now 3 days later, kneeling in the dust while Voss's men pawed at her torn habit, Magdalene understood that dangerous was exactly what they needed. The broken man in the shadows might be their only hope, if there was enough left of him to matter. "You remember me, don't you, Boone?" Voss called out suddenly, his voice cutting through the square's tense silence like a blade through silk. The bandit leader's head had turned toward the shadows, where Caleb stood, his predator's instincts having detected the hidden watcher. From the shadows, Caleb straightened slowly, his movement betraying the careful balance of a man who'd consumed just enough whiskey to dull the pain, but not enough to completely incapacitate himself. The bottle slipped from his nerveless fingers to shatter on the ground, cheap whiskey mixing with dust and blood to create a mud that spoke of wasted lives and broken dreams. "I've been wondering when you'd show your face." Voss continued, his gold teeth glinting in the harsh sunlight. "Caleb Boone, the great scout, the man who drew us a map to his own front door." The crowd gasped, confusion rippling through their ranks like a stone thrown into still water. Heads turned toward Caleb, eyes widening with a mixture of understanding and horror. Magdalene felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The guilt that haunted Caleb's eyes, the way he'd stared at her and the children that first day in town, as if seeing ghosts, the self-hatred that radiated from him like heat from a fever. He hadn't just failed to save his family. He'd led their killers straight to them. "Didn't think I'd track you down, did you?" Voss taunted, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Thought you could hide in a bottle and forget what you helped us do, forget how you drew that pretty little map, showed us exactly when you'd be gone. Exactly where your wife would be waiting." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Murmurs rippled through their ranks, voices raised in shock and dismay. Their broken drunk, the man they'd pitied and scorned, had been an unwitting accomplice to his own family's destruction. The tragedy they'd whispered about in corners suddenly took on new dimensions, becoming something more complex and terrible than simple bad luck. Caleb stepped from the shadows, his movement unsteady but purposeful. His clothes hung on him like rags, his face bore 3 years of whiskey and self-hatred. But his eyes, those eyes that had once been able to read, sign in darkness that had guided countless travelers to safety, still held embers of the man he'd once been. "I remember," he said, his voice carrying across the square like a death knell. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 3 years' worth of guilt and recrimination. "Course you do." Voss laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Remember how trusting you were, how eager to help. We told you we were railroad surveyors, remember? Showed you some fake papers, spun you a story about needing local knowledge for a new rail line. And you ate it up like honey, didn't you?" The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. This was a story they'd never heard, a truth that cast their familiar tragedy in an entirely new light. "We weren't supposed to hurt them." Voss continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. "Original plan was just to rob the place, send you a message about minding your own business. But your pretty little wife, she recognized one of my boys from a wanted poster. Started screaming, calling for help. Well, we couldn't have that, could we?" Caleb's face had gone pale, but he didn't flinch. "My Emma," he whispered. And for a moment the facade cracked, revealing the raw agony beneath. "Pretty little thing," Voss said with casual cruelty, savoring each word like fine wine. "Cried for her papa at the end. Kept asking when you'd come home, when you'd make the bad men go away. We told her you weren't coming, that you'd sent us there yourself. Don't think she believed us, though. Kids that age, they got such faith in their parents." The words hit Caleb like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. But something else was happening too, a change in his posture, a straightening of shoulders that had been bowed by guilt for 3 years. "We left her locket on the kitchen table." Voss continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Thought you might want it back. Course it was all covered in blood by then, but I figured you wouldn't mind. Sentimental value and all that." Something died in Caleb's eyes then, but something else was born. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold certainty of a man with nothing left to lose. "You're gonna pay for that," he said quietly. "With what?" Voss laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "You ain't even armed. Clay took your teeth years ago. Now you're just another drunk waiting to die." But even as he spoke, Caleb was studying the square with professional eyes. The positioning of Voss's men spread out in a loose semicircle around the nun and children. The angle of the sun creating shadows that could provide cover. The way the crowd had bunched together, leaving clear fields of fire for anyone who knew how to use them. 3 years of whiskey had dulled his reflexes, but the instincts were still there, buried beneath layers of guilt and self-recrimination. "Maybe," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying a new note of authority. "But I'm still breathing. And as long as I'm breathing, you got a problem." Voss's expression darkened. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that ends with you in the ground where you belong." While the adults engaged in their deadly verbal sparring, little Rosie had been watching the exchange with the intensity that only children possessed. Her 5-year-old mind might not have understood all the implications of what was being said, but she understood enough to know that the sad man in the shadows was their only hope. She'd been studying the square during the confrontation, noting details that escaped older, more frightened eyes. Mrs. Patterson stood near the general store, her face pale, but her posture strangely alert, as if she were waiting for something. Doc Henley crouched behind a water barrel, his medical bag clutched in arthritic hands, but his eyes held something that didn't belong in a healer's gaze, something hard and calculating. And there, almost hidden in the shadows of the blacksmith shop, was a glint of metal that might have been a rifle barrel. Amos the blacksmith was a mountain of a man, with arms like tree trunks and hands that could bend horseshoes with ease. He'd been watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understood violence, who knew that sometimes good people had to do bad things to protect what mattered. The grown-ups were scared, but they weren't helpless. Not all of them. "You children stay put," Sister Magdalene had whispered when the men first dragged her into the square, her voice carrying despite the rough treatment she was receiving. "No matter what happens, you stay together and you stay safe." But Rosie had seen the way the nun looked at Caleb, had caught the flicker of hope in those brave blue eyes. Sister Magdalene believed in the broken man. With the whiskey shakes, saw something in him that maybe he couldn't see in himself. Maybe it was time someone showed him that faith was worth having. She slipped away from Tommy's protective embrace while the adults were distracted by Voss's taunting. Her small size and the crowd's focus on the confrontation allowed her to move unseen, dodging between legs and around obstacles until she reached the edge of the square. Doc Henley looked up in surprise as she appeared beside his hiding place. "Child, what are you—" "He needs help," she whispered urgently, pointing toward Caleb with one small hand. The man with the sad eyes. "He's hurt inside, but I think he's still good. I think he can save Sister Magdalene." Dr. Cornelius Henley was 73 years old, with white hair and a beard that had once been red as flame. He'd been the town's physician for more than 40 years, had delivered most of the children in Bitter Creek, had sat with the dying and comforted the bereaved. His hands were spotted with age, but they were steady as surgeons' tools, and his eyes held the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in service to others. "Little girl," he said gently, his voice carrying the patience of someone who'd spent decades explaining difficult truths to frightened people. "That man's been dying inside for 3 years. There ain't enough left to save anybody." "Yes, there is," Rosie said with the absolute conviction that only the very young possessed. "Mrs. Patterson told me about the curse on this valley. How bad men keep coming here because something draws them. But maybe good men come here too when they're needed most." Doc Henley's eyebrows rose slightly. He'd heard the local legends about Bitter Creek old Apache stories about a place where spirits gathered where the past wouldn't stay buried, where the desert itself seemed to call out for justice. Most folks dismiss such talk as superstition, the kind of stories that grew up around any place where too much blood had been spilled. But he'd lived here long enough to wonder if there might be something to them. "Oh, what curse, child?" "The one that brought us all here," Rosie said simply, her blue eyes holding depths that seemed impossible in someone so young. "Sister Magdalene and us kids and the bad men and the sad man who lost his little girl. We're all here for a reason. Sometimes people gotta be broken before they can be put back together the right way." Before Doc Henley could respond, the situation in the square exploded into chaos. Tommy had been edging closer to his fellow orphans during Voss's taunting, using the adult's distraction to position himself for action. The 12-year-old had learned hard lessons about survival. In the month since the orphanage fire, had developed the kind of situational awareness that came from living constantly on the edge of disaster. He'd palmed a small stone during the confusion, one of the many rocks that littered the square's packed earth. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was what he had, and Tommy had learned to make do with what was available. Now he made his move, rising from his crouch and hurling the stone with all the force his thin arm could muster. His target was Slick, the weasel-faced killer who'd been advancing on Sister Magdalene with clearly malicious intent. "Leave her alone," Tommy shouted, his young voice cracking with fury and desperation. The stone flew true, striking Slick in the temple with a sound like a melon hitting stone. The impact staggered the gunman, blood streaming down his face as he cursed and stumbled backward. But the distraction gave Sister Magdalene the opening she needed. Despite her bound hands, she managed to lunge sideways, breaking free from her captor's grip and rolling toward the nearest cover, a water trough that stood beside the general store. "Kill them all." Voss roared, his careful plans dissolving into violence and chaos. Kill every last one of them. Guns appeared in the hands of his men, like magic tricks iron blooming from holsters and boot tops. But they were shooting into a crowd of innocents, and their aim was necessarily poor. The ethical calculus of the situation worked against them, and they needed to maintain some semblance of plausible deniability, which meant they couldn't simply massacre everyone in sight. The townspeople scattered like startled birds, some diving for cover behind buildings and water troughs, others running for the dubious safety of the structures that lined the square. Women screamed, children cried, and men shouted orders that no one had the presence of mind to follow. But not all of them ran. Mrs. Patterson had been moving during the commotion, and now she stepped into view with an old shotgun cradled in her weathered hands. The weapon was ancient, probably dating back to the war between the states, but it was clean and well-maintained. Eleanor Patterson might have been a boarding house keeper, but she'd been a frontier wife first, and frontier wives learned to defend themselves. "Amos!" She called out, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos. Now, the blacksmith emerged from his shop like an avenging angel, his massive frame silhouetted in the doorway. He carried a rifle, a newer model than Mrs. Patterson's shotgun, something that spoke of recent preparation rather than old habit. Two more townspeople appeared from concealment armed and determined, their faces set with the kind of grim resolution that came from being pushed too far. They'd been planning this, Caleb realized with a start, waiting for the right moment to strike back against the corruption that had infected their town. The appearance of Voss's gang had provided them with the perfect opportunity. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, and for the first time in 3 years, he smiled. But the smile faded quickly as he saw Doc Henley rise from behind his water barrel, something glinting in his aged hands. The elderly physician looked directly at Caleb, and their eyes meeting across the chaotic square, and nodded once before tossing his burden through the air. A gun belt. Caleb's gun belt, the one Clay had confiscated years ago after one too many drunken incidents. The leather was old, but supple, and the Colt .45 nestled in its holster like it had never left. Caleb caught the belt smoothly, his hands moving with muscle memory as he strapped it around his waist. The familiar weight of the weapon at his hip was like greeting an old friend, a reminder of who he'd been before guilt and whiskey had stolen his purpose. "Now it gets interesting," he said, his voice carrying new authority as his hand dropped to the gun's grip. The transformation was startling. One moment he'd been a broken drunk, the next he was something else entirely. A gunfighter, a scout, a man who'd spent years dancing with death and coming out on top. The whiskey shakes were gone, replaced by the steady hands of a professional. He drew with fluid grace the Colt clearing leather in a motion so smooth it seemed like sleight of hand. The weapon roared, and Slick spun backward into the dust, his chest blooming red as he hit the ground and lay still. The square erupted in gunfire. Caleb's second shot dropped another of Voss's men before the bandit could bring his rifle to bear. The townspeople had found their courage-armed citizens engaging the gang members with the kind of desperate ferocity that came from defending home and family. But Voss wasn't finished. Even as his men fell around him, the bandit leader was moving, his predator's instincts serving him well. During the confusion, he'd managed to grab Samuel, the frail 7-year-old who'd been trying to follow his older brother's example. "Everybody stop," Voss shouted, pressing his gun to Samuel's temple. "Stop shooting or the kid dies." The gunfire ceased abruptly, the square falling silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the soft whimpering of frightened children. Samuel's thin frame shook with terror, but his eyes found Caleb's across the square. There was no accusation there, no blame, only trust that somehow the sad man with the whiskey breath would save him. Caleb felt that trust like a weight on his soul, a responsibility he wasn't sure he could bear. But Samuel reminded him so much of Emma, the same fragile courage, the same faith in adults, to make things right. Now that's better. Voss panted, backing toward his horse with Samuel clutched against his chest. Blood streamed from a wound in his shoulder, but he was far from finished. Now, we're going to have a nice, calm conversation about respect and consequences. But before he could continue, a new voice joined the conversation, one that made everyone in the square freeze with recognition. I don't think so. The voice came from the church bell tower, where a figure had appeared with a rifle trained on the square below. The man was tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes like winter ice. He wore a dark coat that had seen better days, but his bearing spoke of authority and competence. "Who the hell are you?" Voss demanded, his grip tightening on Samuel. "Name's Jake Morrison, federal marshal." The man's voice carried easily across the square, each word precise and clipped. "Been tracking you for 6 months, Garrett. Or do you prefer Red Voss these days?" Garrett. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow, stirring memories he'd tried to bury. William Garrett, the butcher, who'd ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war. The monster who'd helped burn Lawrence, Kansas, and murder 300 civilians in cold blood. "You're supposed to be dead." Voss snarled his voice, betraying the first hint of uncertainty. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Morrison replied with dry humor. "Convenient fiction, actually. Made it easier to track you down without interference from your friends in high places." The federal marshal's appearance had changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local matter, it was a federal case, with all the weight of government authority behind it. "Now drop your weapons and surrender." Morrison continued his rifle, never wavering. "Or I'll put the next shot through your heart instead of your shoulder." But Voss wasn't the type to surrender, even when faced with impossible odds. Even wounded, even outnumbered, he was still a dangerous predator. He proved it by shifting his grip on Samuel, using the child as a human shield while he backed toward his horse. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking some of you with me." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, every person in the square aware that the slightest wrong move could result in a child's death. Caleb found himself calculating angles and distances, looking for any advantage, any opening that might save Samuel without risking the other children. That's when the second revelation hit, and Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with her shotgun raised. "You're not taking anybody else?" she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that came from someone who'd reached the end of their patience. "I won't let you." Voss's eyes widened as he looked at her, and for the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flickered across his features. "You," he breathed. "Me." Mrs. Patterson confirmed, her weathered face set like stone. "Eleanor Patterson. Eleanor Morrison before I married. Jake's my brother." The family resemblance was there once you looked for it. The same ice-blue eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same way of holding themselves that spoke of people who'd never backed down from a fight. "You've been writing to Jake for months." She continued, never taking her eyes off Voss. "Telling him about the strange goings-on in town, about how Clay acted whenever certain riders came through, about the whispered conversations and late-night meetings. You thought you were so clever, but I was watching every move." The crowd was stunned into silence by this revelation. Mrs. Patterson, the kindly boarding house keeper who'd welcomed strangers and cared for orphans, was also a federal informant who'd been gathering intelligence on the corruption that had infected their town. My late husband wasn't the only one with law enforcement experience. She continued, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was revealing. "Before I came to Bitter Creek, I worked with the Pinkerton Agency, specialized in undercover work gathering evidence on criminal enterprises. When Jake told me about the reports coming out of this territory, I volunteered to investigate." Voss's face had gone pale, his certainty crumbling, as he realized the scope of the trap that had been laid for him. You've been here for years. 3 years. Mrs. Patterson confirmed. Came here right after the Boone family was murdered. Figured that kind of violence would draw more of your type eventually, and I was right. You couldn't resist coming back to the scene of your greatest triumph, could you? The pieces were falling into place, now creating a picture that none of them could have imagined. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house had been perfectly positioned to observe the comings and goings in town, to overhear conversations and note suspicious behavior. Her reputation for kindness had made her invisible, just another frontier widow trying to make ends meet. Every raid, every robbery, every act of violence in this territory. She said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I documented all of it. Built a case that'll put Clay in federal prison for the rest of his life, assuming he lives long enough to stand trial. Sheriff Clay, who'd been conspicuously silent during the gunfight, suddenly stepped forward with his rifle raised. But he wasn't aiming at Voss or his men, he was aiming at Mrs. Patterson. You meddling bitch. He snarled, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking. You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you got it all figured out? I know you've been taking money from Garrett's organization for years. Mrs. Patterson replied calmly, her shotgun now trained on the corrupt sheriff. I know you provided information that led to the massacre of 17 innocent people. I know you've been covering up their crimes and taking a cut of the profits. Clay's laugh was bitter and desperate. You know part of it. But you don't know the best part, do you? He gestured toward Caleb with his rifle, his voice taking on the tone of a man who had nothing left to lose. You don't know that our broken drunk here did more than just draw a map. You don't know about the special arrangement we had. Caleb felt ice water flow through his veins. What arrangement? The one where I told Garrett's boys exactly when you'd be away, exactly how long you'd be gone, exactly what route you'd take coming home. Clay said with malicious satisfaction. The one where I made sure there'd be no interference when they paid your family a visit. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Clay hadn't just been corrupt. He'd been an active participant in the Boone family's murder, providing intelligence and ensuring that Caleb would return home, to find his world destroyed. Why, Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. Because you were getting too close, Clay replied. All that scouting work, all those government contracts, you were learning things about territorial politics that made certain people nervous. Had to be stopped. So you had my family killed? I had a problem solved, Clay corrected. Your wife and kid were just collateral damage. The words hung in the superheated air like a curse. For a moment, the square was completely silent, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Then Caleb began to laugh, a sound so cold and empty that it made everyone present shiver, despite the blazing sun. You know what the funny thing is? He said, his voice carrying a deadly calm. I spent 3 years thinking I'd failed them. 3 years drowning in guilt, convinced their deaths were my fault. But it wasn't guilt I should have been feeling. His hand moved to his gun with serpentine grace. It was rage. The Colt cleared leather like liquid lightning, and Clay's rifle went flying as the bullet shattered the stock. The corrupt sheriff stumbled backward, clutching his stinging hands, his face a mask of shock and pain. But the gunshot had another effect. It startled Voss, who'd been focused on the revelations swirling around him. His grip on Samuel loosened for just an instant, and the 7-year-old proved that he was braver than anyone had given him credit for. Samuel bit down hard on Voss's gun hand, his small teeth finding purchase in the soft flesh between thumb and forefinger. Voss howled in pain and surprised, his gun wavering as he tried to shake off the determined child. That moment of distraction was all Caleb needed. His second shot took Voss in the shoulder, spinning the bandit leader around and sending him crashing into his horse. Samuel rolled away from the falling man, his thin frame moving with surprising agility as he scrambled toward safety. But Voss wasn't finished. Even wounded, even betrayed by his own corrupt ally, he was still a killer with decades of experience. He rolled behind his horse, using the animal as cover, while he tried to bring his gun to bear on the children. "If I'm going to hell," he snarled, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth, "I'm taking some innocents with me." His gun swung toward little Rosie, who stood frozen in the middle of the square, her wooden cross clutched in her small hands. Time seemed to slow as Caleb saw the weapon rising, saw death reaching out for another child he'd failed to protect. But this time was different. This time he wasn't too late. Caleb moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of violence. His third shot took Voss center mass, the heavy bullet punching through ribs and into the bandit's black heart. William Garrett, the butcher of Lawrence, the terror of the Arizona Territory, pitched backward into the dust with a look of genuine surprise on his scarred face. For a moment, the only sound was the desert wind sighing through the buildings. Then Marshal Morrison climbed down from the bell tower, his rifle cradled in his arms, his ice-blue eyes surveying the carnage with professional detachment. "Well," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "that's one way to close a case." The aftermath stretched into the evening hours, a complex dance of statements and evidence gathering that would determine the fate of everyone involved. Marshal Morrison proved to be everything his reputation suggested: thorough, fair, and absolutely incorruptible. He interviewed witnesses, examined the scene, and began the process of building a case that would satisfy federal prosecutors. The surviving members of Voss's gang were secured in the town jail, their wounds tended by Doc Henley, with the same professional care he'd shown anyone else. The physician might have been 73 years old, but his hands were still steady and his knowledge comprehensive. More importantly, he understood the ethical obligations of his profession, treating enemies with the same dedication he showed friends. Sheriff Clay presented a more complex problem. His wounds weren't life-threatening, but his crimes were extensive enough to warrant federal charges. Morrison spent considerable time with him, piecing together the full scope of the corruption that had infected the territorial law enforcement system. "How many died because of you?" Morrison asked during one of their sessions, his voice carrying the weight of professional disappointment. He'd seen corruption before, but the scale of Clay's betrayal was particularly galling. Clay's answer was a bitter laugh. "Does it matter? They're dead either way." But it did matter, at least to the families of the victims. Morrison's investigation would eventually uncover evidence linking Clay to 17 separate incidents, ranging from armed robbery to murder. The corrupt sheriff's information had enabled Voss's gang to operate with impunity for years, always staying one step ahead of honest law enforcement. The townspeople of Bitter Creek had mixed reactions to the revelations. Some were angry that they'd been deceived for so long that their trusted sheriff had been working for the enemy. Others were simply relieved that the nightmare was finally over, that they could sleep safely in their beds without fear of midnight raids. But it was the conversation between Caleb and Marshal Morrison that proved most significant for the future. "You've got skills," Morrison said as they sat on the porch of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, watching the sun set behind the red stone cliffs. "Real skills, the kind that don't come from books or training manuals. You've got instincts, experience, the ability to read situations and people." Caleb took a sip from his coffee cup, noting that it was the first time in 3 years he'd preferred coffee to whiskey. "Had skills. Past tense. 3 years of drinking don't exactly keep a man sharp." "Maybe not," Morrison agreed. "But what I saw today wasn't the work of a broken-down drunk. That was the work of a professional, someone who knows how to function under pressure and make the hard choices when lives are on the line." The marshal leaned back in his chair, his ice-blue eyes studying Caleb with the intensity of a man who made his living reading people. "The territorial government is expanding its law enforcement presence. Too much growth, too much opportunity for the wrong kind of people to take advantage. We need experienced officers, people who understand the frontier and know how to handle themselves in difficult situations. You offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to make amends," Morrison corrected. A chance to honor your family's memory by protecting other families from the kind of evil that took them. It was a tempting offer, and not just because of the steady pay and government backing. For 3 years, Caleb had been running from his past, trying to escape the guilt and pain through alcohol and self-destruction. The possibility of turning that experience into something constructive, something that might prevent other families from suffering, as his had held a powerful appeal. But there were other considerations now. 4 orphaned children and a former nun who'd found her true calling outside the church's walls. They'd become his responsibility, his family, in all but blood, and he couldn't simply abandon them for the sake of his own redemption. "I'll need to think about it," he said finally. Morrison nodded, understanding. "Take your time. The offer's not going anywhere." But even as he spoke, they both knew that Caleb's future lay not in federal law enforcement, but in something more personal and immediate. The bond he'd formed with Sister Magdalene and the children was too strong to be broken by career considerations. The wedding took place 6 months later in the new church that had been built with money donated by grateful citizens throughout the territory. Word of Bitter Creek's liberation had spread far and wide, becoming the stuff of legend. The story had grown in the telling, as such stories always did. But the core remained true. A broken man had found redemption through protecting the innocent. Sister Magdalene had left the church officially a process that involved considerable paperwork and soul-searching. Her superiors had been understanding, recognizing that her calling had evolved beyond the traditional boundaries of religious service. She would continue to serve God, but as a wife and mother rather than as a nun. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Tommy served as best man, his young face serious as he handed over the simple gold ring that Caleb had purchased with the reward money from capturing Voss's gang. Mary had found her voice again, and the trauma of the orphanage fire finally beginning to heal. And she sang a hymn that left few eyes dry. Samuel, stronger now, and free from the persistent cough that had plagued him, carried the other ring with solemn dignity. And Rosie scattered flower petals with the same fierce determination she'd shown during the gunfight. Doc Henley performed the ceremony, having been ordained as a minister years earlier when the town had been without clergy. Mrs. Patterson wept openly, her role in the town's salvation having transformed her from a boarding house keeper into something approaching a local hero. Amos the blacksmith had crafted special horseshoes for the occasion, symbols of good luck that would be mounted above the door of their new home. But it was Marshal Morrison who provided the biggest surprise. As the reception wound down and the crowd began to disperse, he approached Caleb with an official-looking document. "Territorial governor's been following your story," he said, his weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Impressed by what you accomplished here. Wants to offer you a different kind of position." Caleb examined the papers, his eyebrows rising as he read the details. "Guide service. Official Territorial Guide Service," Morrison corrected. "Government contract to help settlers navigate safely through the territory. Provide protection, local knowledge, safe passage to new homesteads. Pays good work steady, and you'd be your own boss." It was perfect, almost too perfect to believe. The kind of work that would use all of Caleb's skills while allowing him to stay with his new family to build something positive from the ashes of his former life. "There's one condition," Morrison added. "You'd need to establish a base of operations somewhere central to the major trails. Somewhere that could serve as a hub for the entire operation." Caleb looked around at the town that had become his home, at the people who'd stood with him when it mattered most. "I think we can manage that." And so the Boone Family Guide Service was born, established in a valley north of Bitter Creek, where a clear stream provided year-round water, and the grass grew thick enough to support a substantial remuda. The business grew slowly, but steadily, word spreading through the immigrant communities that there was a family who could be trusted to see travelers safely to their destinations. The work proved to be everything Caleb had hoped for and more, There was deep satisfaction in helping families reach their new homes, in teaching city dwellers how to survive in the wilderness, in being part of something constructive rather than destructive. The skills he'd developed as a scout translated perfectly to civilian guide work, and his reputation for reliability and competence spread throughout the territory. More importantly, the work allowed the family to stay together and grow stronger. Tommy's natural leadership abilities blossomed as he learned the intricacies of trail work and wilderness survival. His protective instincts, honed during the traumatic months after the orphanage fire, made him particularly effective at watching over nervous travelers and ensuring their safety. Mary's mathematical gifts proved invaluable for the business side of the operation. She kept the books with meticulous accuracy, tracked supplies and expenses, and even began corresponding with potential clients to arrange bookings. Her growing confidence was evident in everything she did. The shy, traumatized girl slowly transforming into a competent young woman. Samuel's gentle nature and expanding knowledge of horses made him the family's expert on livestock management. His earlier frailty had given way to a quiet strength, and his understanding of animal behavior proved crucial when dealing with the large remudas necessary for guide work. The desert air had been good for his health, clearing his lungs and giving him the physical stamina he'd never possessed as a child. And Rosie remained their heart, the one whose optimism and faith could lift spirits during the most difficult times. Her presence was a constant reminder of the power of innocence and hope, of the possibility that even the most broken situations could be redeemed through love and determination. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Caleb. The evening meals around their own table, the bedtime stories by lamplight, the Sunday picnics by the stream that ran through their valley. These were the experiences he'd missed with Emma, the simple joys of family life that he'd thought were lost forever. The pain of his daughter's death never fully disappeared, but it changed from a sharp, constant ache to something more bearable, a bittersweet reminder to cherish each moment with his new family. He still carried her memory, but now it served as a bridge between past and present rather than a chain, binding him to guilt and self-recrimination. 5 years after the confrontation in Bitter Creek Square, Caleb stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching his children work with the horses in the main corral. Tommy, now 17, moved with the confident grace of someone who'd found his calling. He was breaking in a new mount, his patience and skill evident in every movement as he worked with the spirited animal. Mary, 14 now, and blossoming into a beautiful young woman, sat at a desk under the ramada, working on correspondence for their guide service. Her pen moved steadily across the paper as she answered inquiries from potential clients, her business acumen growing more sophisticated with each passing year. Samuel, 12, and no longer the frail child he'd once been, was examining the hooves of their pack animals, his gentle touch calming even the most nervous horses. His transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. From a sickly boy who could barely walk a mile to a capable young man who could handle any aspect of their operation. And Rosie, 10 years old, and still the family's beacon of optimism, was teaching a group of younger children from town how to care for their ponies. Her patience and enthusiasm made her a natural teacher, and several parents had begun bringing their children to the ranch specifically to learn from her. "They're growing up fast," Magdalene said, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of coffee. At 35, she was more beautiful than ever, the harsh life of the frontier having added character to her features, without diminishing her essential grace. Too fast. Caleb agreed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Sometimes I look at them and wonder where the time went. Would you change anything?" She asked the question, carrying deeper implications than its surface simplicity suggested. Caleb considered the question seriously, as he always did, when Magdalene posed one of her thoughtful inquiries. Would he change the events that had brought them together? The tragedy that had destroyed his first family, but created the conditions for his second. The pain and guilt that had nearly destroyed him, but ultimately led to redemption. "No," he said finally. "I regret that Emma died, that she'll never grow up to see the woman she might have become. But I don't regret the path that led us here. Don't regret finding you, finding them." He gestured toward the children. "Don't regret learning that sometimes broken things can be put back together in ways that make them stronger than before." Magdalene smiled, leaning against his shoulder, in the comfortable way that couples develop after years of shared experience. "The children asked me yesterday if we're going to have more babies." Caleb raised an eyebrow, though he wasn't entirely surprised by the question. The children had been dropping hints for months about wanting younger siblings, about the possibility of expanding their family through more traditional means. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that families come in all shapes and sizes, and ours was already perfect." She paused, her voice taking on a note of gentle humor. "But I also told them that God works in mysterious ways, and we should be open to whatever blessings He might send." 2 years later, their son was born, a healthy boy, with Caleb's dark hair and Magdalene's blue eyes. They named him David, after the biblical king who had faced giants and won through faith and courage. The 4 older children doted on their baby brother, with the fierce protectiveness of those who understood how precious family truly was. David's arrival seemed to complete something in all of them, creating a sense of wholeness that had been missing even during their happiest moments. He was the bridge between their past and future, the living symbol of their ability to create new life and love from the ashes of old tragedies. As the years continued to pass, their guide service became legendary throughout the Southwest. The Boone family was known for their integrity, their skill, and their willingness to help those who couldn't pay full price. They never lost a client to bandits' bad weather or poor navigation, and their reputation spread as far as the California coast and the Colorado Territory. Tommy eventually took over much of the day-to-day operations, his natural leadership abilities, and hard-won experience, making him one of the most respected guides in the territory. He married a schoolteacher named Sarah and had children of his own, but he never moved far from the family ranch, understanding that some bonds were too strong to be broken by distance. Mary fulfilled her promise as a writer, documenting the changing face of the American West, with the eye of someone who had lived through its transformation. Her articles appeared in newspapers and magazines throughout the country, bringing attention to the challenges and opportunities of frontier life. Her book about their experiences, titled Children of the Desert, became a bestseller and helped shape public understanding of Western expansion. Samuel pursued his dream of becoming a veterinarian, his gentle nature and deep understanding of animal behavior earning him respect throughout the region. His practice served both the growing towns and the isolated ranches, and his willingness to travel long distances to help animals in need made him something of a folk hero among the ranching community. Rosie became a teacher and advocate for orphan children, establishing schools and care facilities throughout the territory. She never married, claiming that her family was large enough already, but she wore Emma's locket, a gift from Caleb, on her 18th birthday, as a reminder of the power of faith and the possibility of redemption. And David grew up knowing he was part of something larger than himself, part of a family built on love rather than blood, part of a legacy that stretched back to a dusty square in Bitter Creek, where broken people had found the courage to stand against evil. Caleb lived to see his grandchildren grow to adulthood, to witness the taming of the West he had helped explore and settle. The railroad came to their valley in 1895, bringing with it the modern world that would eventually transform the frontier into something unrecognizable. But by then, the Boone family had already established their place in the territory's history, their story becoming part of the legend of the American West. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family he had saved and who had in turn saved him. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his redemption, former clients who remembered his guidance, townspeople who had been inspired by his courage, children who had learned from his example that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. At the service held in the church that had been built with the reward money from Voss's capture, the current sheriff, an honest man elected by the people, spoke of Caleb's heroism, of how one broken man had found the courage to stand against evil when it mattered most. But it was David now, a man of 33 with children of his own, who delivered the most fitting eulogy. "My father used to say that heroes aren't people who never fall down," he told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "Heroes are people who get back up, who find a reason to keep fighting even when everything seems lost, who understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns or fists, but with love and faith and the willingness to sacrifice for others." He paused, looking out over the faces of people whose lives had been touched by Caleb's journey from despair to redemption. Caleb Boone was a hero not because he never failed, but because when he did fail, he found a way to turn that failure into something beautiful. He found a way to honor the daughter he couldn't save by saving others. He found a way to transform his greatest weakness into his greatest strength. The crowd was silent, moved by the simple truth of those words. "And maybe," David continued, "that's the most important lesson he taught us. That it's never too late to change, never too late to find redemption, never too late to become the person we were meant to be. That love doesn't end with death, it just finds new ways to grow." As the service ended and the crowd began to disperse, Magdalene, now an elderly woman with silver hair, but eyes still bright with the fire that had first caught Caleb's attention, remained by the graveside. She was joined by her children and grandchildren, by friends and former clients, by people whose lives had been touched by the story that had begun with violence and despair in a dusty town square. Tommy stepped forward and placed something on the fresh earth, Emma's locket, the one that had traveled from Caleb to Rosie and back again over the years, a symbol of love that transcended death and bound the family together across time and tragedy. "For Emma," he said simply, "so she knows we kept faith with her memory." As the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the family walked slowly back toward their ranch. Behind them, the wind whispered through the desert grass, carrying with it the scents of sage and possibility, the promise that tomorrow could be better than today, for those with the courage to make it so. The story that had begun with violence and despair had become something beautiful, a testament to the transforming power of love, faith, and the unshakable belief that no one is beyond saving, no matter how far they've fallen or how much they've lost. In the distance, the church bells of Bitter Creek began to ring, calling the faithful to evening services. The sound carried across the desert a reminder that hope could flourish even in the harshest places, that light could shine even in the deepest darkness, that redemption was always possible for those willing to fight for it. And in a small cemetery on the outskirts of town, 3 graves lay side by side, one marked with a simple headstone bearing the name Caleb Boone, beloved husband and father. Another honoring Magdalene Boone, devoted wife and mother. And the third smaller marker for Emma Boone, the daughter whose death had set in motion a chain of events that would touch hundreds of lives and prove that even the greatest tragedies could become the seeds of the most profound redemption. The West was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year. But the lessons learned in that dusty square about courage and redemption, about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, about the truth that family is defined not by blood, but by choice, those lessons would endure as long as people remembered that broken things could be made whole again, that lost souls could find their way home, and that love was always stronger than death. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.